They say real strength doesn't need to shout. When the woman in the slate gray suit walked into Precinct 22, Officer Delgado assumed she was just another civilian. He didn't know about her years in covert operations, the classified missions, or the long list of corrupt officials she had quietly dismantled. But he was about to find out. The morning at Precinct 22 was like any other. Paperwork piling up, phones ringing off the hook, and the smell of burnt coffee hanging thick in the air. I was buried under a stack of reports, hoping to get ahead before my caffeine went cold. The usual bustle of officers moving between desks, printers churning out warrants, and an occasional burst of laughter from the bullpen made for a familiar backdrop. Then Delgado walked in. He had a way of carrying himself, like he owned every room he entered. His badge wasn't just identification, it was a crown, and he used it like one, lording over anyone he considered beneath him. It wasn't confidence. It was unchecked arrogance wrapped in a uniform. I was mid-sentence in a particularly dull report when I noticed movement at the entrance. Delgado leaned casually against the doorway, his trademark smirk in place. Trouble had arrived, and then I saw her. A woman, Asian mid-40s with silver strands woven through her jet black hair. She wore a tailored gray suit that probably cost more than my rent. There was a precision in her movements, like every step was calculated. In her hand, she carried a sleek, metallic briefcase. Her eyes scanned the precinct with the sharpness of someone who had assessed more dangerous situations in a glance than most would in a lifetime. But Delgado? He saw what he wanted to see. Lost sweetheart? Delgado drawled, stepping into her path. City Hall's down the street. His tone carried the lazy arrogance of someone who had never been challenged. The woman stopped. A subtle shift in her posture, barely noticeable. But suddenly, the air in the precinct seemed colder. "No," she said, her voice steady, controlled. "I have business here." Delgado chuckled, making a show of looking her up and down. "Oh yeah? What kind of business could someone like you possibly have here? Filing a noise complaint? Dropping off a package?" I felt my hands clench. The way she carried herself, the way she stood, told me she was dangerous in a way Delgado couldn't comprehend. "Something far more significant," she replied, adjusting her grip on the briefcase. The harsh fluorescent light reflected off her wrist. Was that a scar? But Delgado didn't see it, didn't recognize the warning signs. "You know," he continued, voice dripping with condescension, "if you're here for something official, the side entrance is around back. But honestly, we don't usually let your type in at all." The room stilled. A few officers nearby turned toward the exchange, sensing the shift in atmosphere. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. But the next word she spoke carried a weight that made the entire precinct take notice. "Your name and badge number, officer." Delgado scoffed. "Oh, planning to file a complaint? Fine. Officer Delgado. Badge 6721. Write it down if you need to, sweetheart." Before she could respond, another officer came barreling down the hallway. It was Ramirez, and he looked terrified. "Deputy Director Lin," he blurted, skidding to a stop. I didn't realize you'd arrived already." Delgado's smirk vanished. "Deputy Director?" His voice wavered. "That's right." Ramirez swallowed hard. "Deputy Director Lin. Former military intelligence. Counterterrorism unit. FBI Oversight Committee." The silence was deafening. Delgado's skin lost its color. Deputy Director Lin exhaled, setting her briefcase on a nearby desk with a quiet click. "Officer Delgado," she said smoothly, "my office." Now, no one knew what happened in that office. But when Delgado walked out 45 minutes later, he wasn't the same man who had strutted in. His face was pale, his hands shook slightly, and he jumped at sudden noises for weeks afterward. Word traveled fast. Deputy Director Lin wasn't just a bureaucrat. She had spent years embedded in operations that weren't meant to be spoken of. The scar on her wrist? A reminder from a hostage rescue in Jakarta. The briefcase? Bulletproof, custom-made. She had spent a decade taking apart corruption from the inside. That night, after most of the precinct had cleared out, I found myself alone with her in the break room. "Deputy Director Lin," I said, hesitating. "I just wanted to say, welcome." She glanced up from a file, and for the first time, I saw something softer in her expression. "Thank you," she said. Then she studied me for a moment. "You were watching earlier. You wanted to step in?" I shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, I should have." She was silent for a moment before she spoke. "Sometimes the most powerful weapon is restraint. I've learned that the hard way." Her gaze drifted, as if seeing something far beyond the precinct walls. "In Istanbul, I spent 8 months undercover. Every day, I endured hostility, small humiliations, condescension. But when we moved, we took down a trafficking ring that had operated for over a decade." She set down her coffee cup, her fingers brushing absently over the scar. "Real change," she continued, "doesn't happen overnight. It happens in the moments where you choose to dismantle the system instead of just fighting the symptoms." The changes she brought weren't immediate, but they were permanent. She implemented new policies, training sessions that went beyond the usual diversity seminars, a real, anonymous reporting system, internal investigations into misconduct. And she made one thing very clear: even the smallest act of discrimination had consequences. Delgado disappeared for a month on mandatory retraining. When he returned, the cockiness was gone. The only thing left was the haunted look in his eyes whenever Deputy Director Lin walked past. No one knew what happened in that office, but we all understood one thing. True power doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't scream, doesn't demand attention. It simply exists, undeniable and unshakable. And for me, watching it unfold that day, I learned something important. Power isn't about speaking louder. It's about knowing who you are and letting others realize it in their own time, even if it takes a few scars along the way. In the weeks and months that followed Deputy Director Lin's arrival, the precinct changed in ways both seen and unseen. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic showdowns, just a steady, quiet shift in how things worked. Some officers left, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new expectations. Others, like me, found themselves re-evaluating the way they had always operated, recognizing how deeply ingrained biases had shaped the culture of the department. Lynn never asked for admiration, never sought validation for the work she did. She simply moved forward, dismantling the old systems one policy at a time, replacing them with structures designed to hold people accountable, to ensure real justice was served, not just for those in uniform, but for the people we were supposed to protect. It wasn't easy. There was pushback, resentment. Some officers muttered about her behind closed doors, clinging to the comfort of the old ways, pretending their methods had never been the problem. But Lynn never reacted to their whispers. She didn't need to, because when the first reports of misconduct were investigated, when officers who had operated with impunity for years were suddenly facing real consequences, everyone realized the era of unchecked power was over. Even Delgado, once the loudest in any room, had become a shadow of himself. He moved cautiously, spoke carefully. His arrogance had been replaced by fear, or maybe the realization that he was no longer untouchable. One evening, I stood in the precinct's observation room, staring at the case files Lynn had reopened, buried incidents, ignored victims, now finally being heard. She appeared beside me. "Thinking about the past?" she asked. I nodded. "And the future?" She studied the files, then exhaled. "The future is built on the choices we make today." I turned to her. "You could be anywhere, leading federal teams, working high-profile cases. Why here?" Lynn smiled. "Because change doesn't happen in meetings. It happens in places like this, where the problems are real, where people like Delgado think they're untouchable." She tapped a file. "I can't fix everything overnight, but I can start, and that's enough." I understood then. True power isn't about commanding fear. It's persistence, fighting battles that may never end, knowing that every step forward still matters. As Lynn returned to her work, I knew Precinct 22 would never be the same.